The first time I saw Queen Valeth of the Saranthari, she was standing in the middle of a crater that used to be the interspecies diplomatic pavilion, and she was the only thing in the rubble that wasn't broken. Her wings were folded tight against her back, great luminous things the color of deep water just before it goes dark, edged in bioluminescent filaments that pulsed a slow, steady violet. She wore a gown of woven light thread that had been silver before the explosion and was now mostly ash. Her face was angular and pale as carved moonstone, and her eyes, when she turned them toward me, were the precise color of a solar eclipse, gold burning around an absolute black center. She looked at me with those eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said in perfect, unaccented English, "You are the human ambassador." I said. "I'm not sure what I am now." The pavilion sort of blew up. She looked at what remained of the pavilion, then back at me. "You have blood on your temple," she said. "I have a lot of things on my temple," I said. "Most of them are pavilion." Something moved in her expression. It wasn't a smile. I wouldn't learn until much later that Valeth of the Saranthari didn't smile, not the way humans did anyway, with the corners of their mouths lifting in a shape that meant warmth. When she found something genuinely amusing, the bioluminescent filaments along her wings flickered. Just once. Just briefly. They flickered now. I filed that away without knowing why. "The summit will need to be relocated," she said. Her voice had settled into the register of a woman announcing something obvious to someone who was clearly struggling to keep up. "The Dravathi delegation has already retreated to their ship. The Korani mediators are signaling that they consider the bombing an act of provocation by whichever party they currently distrust most, which appears to change by the hour." She turned and began walking through the rubble without looking at where she stepped, as though her feet simply knew. "Come. If you stay in this crater, the Dravathi snipers on the ridge will have a clean line." I stared at her back. "There are snipers." "There were. My guard handled them 17 minutes ago." She didn't look back. I said, "Come, ambassador." I came. That was 3 years ago. In the time between that crater and now, a number of things had happened. The summit had been relocated twice. The Dravathi had eventually agreed to terms, then broken them, then agreed again under conditions that involved a 12-hour negotiation in a ship's cargo hold that smelled of something I never identified and would prefer not to. The Korani mediators had switched their distrust to the Saranthari and back again so many times that I had stopped tracking it and simply treated all their statements as baseline neutral. And I had become, in some formal and then increasingly informal capacity, Queen Valeth's primary human liaison. The formal part was easy to explain. The Saranthari had requested me by name after the Pavilion Summit. Queen Valeth had submitted a diplomatic communique to Earth's Interstellar Relations Committee that described my conduct during the evacuation. The 6 Saranthari civilians I had pulled from the rubble before medics arrived, the partial blast shield I had improvised from my own body weight, and a fallen door panel. In precise, bureaucratic language that contained no warmth and conveyed absolute respect. The Urcom had been so surprised to receive a formal commendation from a species that usually communicated in layered subtext and tactical ambiguity that they'd promoted me on the spot. The informal part was harder to explain. It had accumulated slowly, a request for my presence at this summit rather than another. A preference, noted in logistical dispatches, for coordinating through me on matters that other ambassadors handled through their own liaisons. A pattern of scheduling that, when I mapped it out one evening in my quarters on the Meridian Station, produced a picture of consistent, recurring contact that went well beyond diplomatic necessity. I had tried a few times to mention this to my supervisor. She had looked at the scheduling data, looked at me and said, "Kale, the Saranthari Queen keeps specifically requesting you for sensitive negotiations. She's never missed a meeting you're assigned to, and she submitted a commendation that called you, I'm quoting, an individual of exceptional moral clarity and structural reliability. That's basically a love letter in Saranthari diplomatic language. It was a commendation, I'd said. Sure, she'd said, sure it was. I had not raised the subject again. The trouble in the third year was a formal matter. The Saranthari Council of Rings, the governing body beneath the throne, composed of 7 elected representatives from each of the 7 rings of the homeworld, had sent a resolution to Queen Valeth's desk. The resolution had many clauses. The relevant one, translated from Saranthari formal register into plain English by the diplomatic AI with a note that said idiom approximation, emotional weight may be imprecise, read. It is the finding of this council that the sustained and unusually proximate engagement between the Crown and the human liaison designate Kael Doran of Earth has created the appearance, if not the substance, of an improper alignment of interests between a sovereign of the Saranthari people and a representative of a species that remains in active treaty negotiation with the Crown. The Council therefore requests that the liaison arrangement be restructured to ensure appropriate distance, and that, pending review, Ambassador Doran be reassigned to a secondary tier of access. I had read this twice. Then I had set it down and stared at the wall for a while. Then Valeth's personal aide, a young Saranthari named Thessaly, who had the rare quality among her people of displaying her emotions clearly and without apparent embarrassment, had appeared at my door and said, "The Queen requests your presence." The Queen's private office aboard the Saranthari crown ship Velos was a room I had been in perhaps 40 times. I had stopped being conscious of its strangeness around visit 6 or 7. The walls that shifted color with the ambient emotional register of the room's occupant, currently a cool, even blue. The low furniture scaled for Saranthari proportions that I navigated without thinking now. The view through the transparent hull panel of the stars outside, which were always there, always different, always the same. Valeth was standing at the hull panel when I came in. Her wings were half extended, not fully, which would have been a formal display, but enough that I could see the full gradient of deep-water blue fading into the luminescent edge. She was still for a long moment after I entered. "You've read the Council's resolution," she said. "It wasn't a question." "Thessaly sent it to me before she came to find me," I said. "I think she thought I should have a moment." Thessaly thinks a great deal about what people should have. There was something in Valeth's voice that I could not name a tension, like a string drawn too tight. She is often correct. I waited. Valeth turned from the hull panel. Her eyes found mine with the directness that had always been her most disorienting quality. The Saranthari, I had learned, did not use eye contact the way humans did. Among their people, sustained eye contact was a form of declaration. Most Saranthari were careful about it in cross-species interactions, understanding the potential for misreading. Valeth had never been careful about it with me. I had never let myself ask why. "The Council's resolution is not without merit," she said. "You are a representative of a species in active treaty negotiation with the Crown. Structural proximity between a sovereign and a negotiating partner's primary liaison does create potential complications." "That's a very reasonable reading of the situation," I said. "It is," she agreed. Something moved through the light filaments of her wings, a ripple too fast and complex for me to parse with my still incomplete reading of Saranthari nonverbal language. "I have reviewed the resolution, and I have considered the Council's recommendation." A pause. "I am going to ask you to step back from your current role," she said, "effective at the end of this mission cycle. The Urcom will be notified that the Saranthari Crown is requesting a rotation of liaison personnel." The room felt, for a moment, like the pavilion crater. Something structural had just given way, and I was still catching up to the fact of its absence. "I see," I said. The transition will be managed carefully. I will ensure your career record reflects the full value of your service." Her voice was perfectly even, controlled. The walls of the room, I noticed, had shifted, not dramatically, but the blue had deepened, gone cooler. "Of course," I said, "I understand." I did not understand. Or rather, I understood the words, the bureaucratic logic, the political sense of it. I did not understand why it felt like something was being pulled out by its root. I had been telling myself for 3 years that what existed between Queen Valeth of the Saranthari and human ambassador Kael Doran was professional regard, mutual respect, an effective working relationship that had, incidentally, produced some of the best cross-species diplomatic outcomes of the last decade. I had been very good at telling myself this. "Then I'll begin the handover documentation," I said. My voice came out steady. I was proud of it in a distant way. "Is there anything else you need from me before I start?" Valeth looked at me. The room was very quiet. The stars moved outside the panel, slow and indifferent. "No," she said, "that will be all." I nodded, I turned, I walked to the door. I was almost through it when a voice said, "Ambassador Doran." It was not Valeth's voice. It was smaller, higher, and coming from the left. I turned. Sitting in one of the low chairs against the far wall, a chair I had not looked at when I entered, because it was set back from the main conversation space, and I had not thought to check, was a child. She was, at a guess, roughly the Saranthari equivalent of 10 or 11 years old. She had her mother's wings, but in miniature, and where Valeth's bioluminescent filaments were violet, this child's were a bright, improbable green, the color of new growth, of something that hadn't decided yet what it was going to be. Her eyes were the same solar eclipse gold and black as her mother's, but in her small face they looked enormous, and they were fixed on me with an expression of such transparent, earnest alarm that I stopped moving entirely. This was Princess Saraveth. I had met her twice before, briefly at formal functions. She had been shy on both occasions. She was not shy now. "Ambassador Doran," she said again, and her voice was very serious in the way that children's voices are when they are saying something they have decided matters enormously. "My mother is lying." The silence that followed was profound. I looked at the princess. I looked at Queen Valeth. The queen's wings had gone very still. A stillness that I had learned, in 3 years, meant she was experiencing something she did not know how to respond to. "Saraveth," Valeth said, and her voice contained roughly 17 layers of controlled warning. "She loves you very much," Saraveth continued, as though her mother had not spoken. Her small hands were folded in her lap. Her chin was up. She had the look of someone who has decided to do a frightening thing and is not going to stop now that they've started. "She has loved you for a long time. She talks about you to Thessaly when she thinks I am asleep. She keeps the record of the pavilion evacuation on her desk terminal, and she reads it sometimes when she is tired. She said once that you were the only person in all the negotiations who never tried to use her, and she didn't know what to do with that." "Saraveth," Valeth's voice had gone very quiet. "You are not being asked to leave because of the council," Saraveth said to me. "The council's resolution came after she had already decided to ask you to leave. She decided to ask you to leave because she is afraid. She has been afraid for a long time." The girl paused. Her luminescent filaments pulsed green, a slow and steady rhythm that looked, somehow, like resolve. "I think someone should tell you this. Because you were walking out the door, and you looked the way people look when they are sad, but they are not going to say so. And I think that is very wasteful when the thing making you sad is fixable." I stood in the doorway for what was probably a long time. Then I looked at Valeth. Valeth was not looking at me. She was looking at her daughter. The walls of the room had shifted again, past blue, into something I had never seen before in this office. A deep, almost bruised indigo, the color of something raw and exposed. "You are," Valeth said to Saraveth, very quietly, going to be an extraordinary amount of difficulty for the rest of my life. Yes, Saraveth agreed without remorse. I did not leave. I closed the door. I turned around. I crossed the room and I sat down in the low chair nearest to the princess, because my legs had made a unilateral decision about whether I was going to keep standing, and I thought it would be more dignified to sit intentionally than to not sit accidentally. Your Majesty, I said, I think we need to have a different conversation than the one we were having. Valeth stood very still at the center of the room. Her wings were completely still now, not the tense stillness of before, but something else. Something that looked, in the vocabulary of Saranthari body language that I had spent 3 years learning, like a person standing at the edge of a place they had never meant to go and finding that they were already most of the way there. Saraveth, she said, still looking at the wall, go find Thessaly. Are you going to talk properly to him? Saraveth asked, with the directness of someone who has already committed to the catastrophe and might as well ensure it's productive. I am going to attempt it, Valeth said. Please go. Saraveth looked at me. I looked at Saraveth. Something passed between us, the wordless solidarity of two people who have both been worrying about the same person for a while without knowing the other person existed. She stood, folded her small green filigreed wings tidily, and walked to the door. At the door she stopped. Ambassador Doran, she said. Yes. She keeps a picture of you also. It is from the summit on Marin Station, the one where you stayed for 4 extra days to help finish the secondary clauses. She has it in the drawer of her nightstand and she thinks no one has noticed. A pause. I notice most things. I am very observant. I can see that, I said. She left. The room was quiet for a long time. Valeth stood with her back to me, facing the hull panel and the stars. Her wings had begun to move, not dramatically, not in any way that spoke of agitation. A slow, oceanic motion, the deep-water color shifting and resettling like a tide that didn't know which way the shore was. I waited, because I had learned that Valeth organized her thoughts in ways that took time, and that interrupting the process produced worse outcomes than waiting. She is 10 years old, Valeth said at last. Yes. She has her grandmother's complete disregard for the concept of appropriate timing. She seemed to think this was appropriate timing, I said carefully. She seemed to think I was about to leave and not come back. You were. Yes. Another silence. She is not wrong, Valeth said, about the things she said. The careful, formal part of my brain, the part that had been an ambassador for long enough to learn the difference between what someone says and what they mean, and the further difference between what they mean and what they're able to say, went very quiet. The rest of me said, I know. Valeth turned from the panel. I had seen her face in crisis negotiations. I had seen her face across the table from species who respected nothing short of a show of force, and she had shown them force so calmly that it looked like weather. I had seen her face when she was tired, when she was sharp with exhaustion, and still sharper with the need to get to the end of something. I had seen her face when something moved her, not often, because she kept that interior landscape very private, but once or twice, in unguarded moments, I had caught a glimpse of it. I had never seen it look like this. You understand, she said slowly, that this is not simple. I know. I am a sovereign. You are a representative of a species in active treaty negotiation with my people. There are structural realities that cannot be wished away. I know, I said again. I had concluded that the correct course of action was to remove the situation before it became complicated. She said the word like she had considered many other words and found them all insufficient. The Council's resolution provided a useful mechanism. It would have appeared to be a politically motivated restructuring rather than a personal decision. That's very thorough, I said. I am generally thorough. I know. I looked at her, at the walls, which were still that raw indigo, and at the wings, still moving in that slow, uncertain tide. For what it's worth, it would have worked. I would have believed it was the council. Something crossed her expression. You did believe it. For about 3 seconds, I said. Then your 10-year-old spoke. The filaments along her wings flickered. Once. That brief, brilliant flicker that I had been cataloging for 3 years without fully understanding what I was cataloging. She is very perceptive, Valeth said. Where does she get it? A longer pause. There are structural realities, Valeth said again, but more quietly now. I have not, she stopped, started again. Among my people, when a sovereign forms a significant personal bond with a foreign diplomatic party, it creates governance complications. There have been historical precedents, and they are not, on the whole, encouraging. What happened? I asked. The bond became leverage in every case. Her voice was very even, not always immediately, not always intentionally. But the bond existed, and therefore the bond could be used, and it was. She met my eyes, that direct, sustained contact that she had always maintained with me, that I now understood in the vocabulary of her people, was a form of declaration she had been making for as long as we'd known each other. I have guarded against it, with you, for a long time. I have maintained appropriate structure. I have ensured that my regard for you has not visibly affected the negotiations. Has it affected them? I asked. No, she said immediately. Then, not in the ways that would concern the council. You have never tried to use our connection to gain advantage in the treaty process. You have never leveraged personal familiarity to push for terms your government wanted. In 3 years, I have never once observed you try to extract anything from me through the back channel of what exists between us. Her wings stilled. That has been its own kind of problem. I blinked. I'm sorry. It is very difficult, Valeth said, with the precision of someone choosing their words like they're navigating a minefield, to maintain the belief that a personal connection is a structural liability when the person in question consistently refuses to treat it as a resource. I sat with that for a moment. You were waiting, I said slowly, for me to use it against you. I was prepared for it. And when I didn't, I became uncertain, she said. I do not enjoy being uncertain. I am a queen. Uncertainty is generally something I manage in other parties, not myself. The filaments flickered again, brief, involuntary. It became increasingly difficult to maintain appropriate distance when you were consistently you. I've been me the whole time, I said. I am aware. She looked away, back toward the stars, and for a moment I could see the profile of her, the angular jaw, the high cheekbones, the sweep of her wings, and the way she held herself, which was the posture of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time, and had gotten so accustomed to the weight that they'd stopped noticing it was there. Valeth, I said. She didn't look at me. But something in her stilled further, in the way of a person who is listening very carefully while pretending not to be. The council's concerns are legitimate structural concerns, I said. I'm not dismissing them. The history you're describing is real and the caution makes sense. I waited a beat. But I've been a diplomat for 11 years. I've worked with a lot of different species. I've had a lot of different liaisons and counterparts and relationships that needed careful navigation. I paused. I have never, not once, structured my professional life around making sure I was in the same room as someone. I have never mapped someone's scheduling patterns and then restructured my own calendar to ensure we were in proximity. I have never read a commendation 3 or 4 times on a slow evening because it was in someone's words, and the words felt like something. The room was very quiet. I haven't done any of those things, I said, but I think you might have. Valeth was still facing the stars. I have a Saranthari translation specialist, she said, after a very long silence, who has told me that certain human emotional vocabulary is context-dependent, and that I should not assume I understand what a word means because I understand its technical definition." "That's good advice," I said. "She told me," Valeth continued, still looking at the stars, "that when a human says they find someone remarkable, that the word carries weight, that it is not typically used in formal register. That using it in a commendation that went to 17 people was notable." "I used that word," I said very carefully, "in a formal commendation about you to 17 people. I am aware, and I'm only hearing about it now." I was not certain what to do with the information. She finally turned. Her eyes found mine. "I am still not certain, but I find myself in the position of having been somewhat forced to transparency by a 10-year-old, and I am attempting to determine how to proceed." I stood up from the low chair. The room was not large. The distance between us was not large. I crossed it. She watched me come. She did not step back. "Here is what I think," I said. "I think the Council's structural concerns can be addressed structurally. I think we can involve them, be transparent about what this is, build in the oversight and the safeguards that would prevent a personal connection from becoming a governance liability. I think there are Saranthari legal precedents for sovereign relationships with foreign parties, even if the historical examples weren't great. And I think the fact that they weren't great was a product of one party using the bond as leverage, which, as you've noted, I haven't done and don't intend to." "You are proposing a diplomatic solution," she said, "to a personal problem." "I'm proposing that we treat it as both," I said, "because it is both." Something shifted in her expression. The wings, those great deep-water wings that I had been watching for 3 years without letting myself name what I was doing, spread slightly. Not dramatically. An opening. A few degrees of extension, that meant, in the Saranthari vocabulary I had spent 3 years learning like a language I wasn't sure I'd ever get to use. I am listening. I am present. I am here. "You learned our nonverbal language," she said quietly. "I've been learning it for 3 years. You never told me. You never asked, and I wasn't sure I was reading it correctly." I met her eyes, that sustained contact that she had always maintained with me, that I now understood, in the vocabulary of her people, was a form of declaration she had been making for as long as we'd known each other. "I think I've been reading it correctly." The filaments along her wings flickered again. And again. Not the single brief flicker of something restrained, a sustained, warm ripple, moving from the roots of the wings outward, violet bleeding into something that was almost white at the edges. I had never seen that before. "That," she said very quietly, "is." "I know," I said. "You do not know what it means." "Tell me." A long pause. The stars moved outside the panel. The walls of the room, I noticed, had shifted, not indigo anymore. Something warmer. A color I didn't have a name for, somewhere between deep amber and the last light before dark. "Among my people," she said, "the filaments respond to involuntary emotion. We have significant control over most of our nonverbal expression. The filaments are less controlled. They respond to states that are too significant for the normal suppression to manage." She paused. "What you are observing is what happens when I am." She stopped. Started again. "When someone another stop." I waited. "When someone I care for very deeply," she said finally, "says something that confirms that the caring is mutual." I looked at her for a long moment. "Mutual," I said. "Yes." "Valeth, you were about to send me away." "Yes." "You were going to use a council resolution as cover for not having to say this." "Yes, a beat. It was a very good plan." "It was a terrible plan," I said. The filaments rippled again, and this time they took the edge light with them, the bioluminescent fringe of her wings brightening briefly like a tide coming in. "Yes," she said. "I am becoming aware of that." What followed was not simple. I had told her the truth. The council's structural concerns were legitimate, and they were going to need to be addressed structurally. We spent the next 3 weeks in a different kind of negotiation than any I had been involved in before. Careful, frank, conducted with both of us at the table and neither of us pretending to be fully comfortable. The Saranthari Council of Rings was not hostile, cautious. They had seen the historical record. They asked hard questions, and Valeth answered them without the usual sovereign circumspection that had always been her primary diplomatic mode. And I answered mine as an ambassador who understood he was now also a party with a personal stake. And the combination of that unusual transparency appeared to produce, in the council, something like cautious willingness. They did not approve exactly. They established oversight conditions and review periods and a formal declaration of the relationship's existence that went into the Saranthari public record. They were meticulous about it. They were, Valeth told me, doing what the Council of Rings was supposed to do, serving as a structural safeguard against a sovereign acting without accountability. "You seem less annoyed by them than I expected," I said, one evening after a particularly long session. "They are doing their job," she said. She was sitting near the hull panel, wings loose and partially extended in the way she allowed only when she was genuinely at rest, a state I had seen rarely before and was now beginning to see more often. I should not be annoyed when the structures I depend on to govern justly function as intended. That's a very mature position. "I have reigned for 14 years, she said. "I have had time to develop mature positions." She looked at me with those eclipse eyes. "I am also, if I am being accurate, somewhat relieved." By the oversight conditions. By the fact that the conversation happened at all. A pause. I am not accustomed to transparency in this particular domain. I have been a sovereign since I was 22. The domains of personal feeling and political visibility are not ones that typically coexist comfortably. She looked at the stars outside. I had become very practiced at not allowing them to. "Until a 10-year-old blew the whole thing up," I said. The filaments along her wings flickered, warm and bright. "She is entirely her grandmother," Valeth said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite warmth and was entirely warmth. "My mother had the same complete immunity to diplomatic timing. She once told my father, at a formal state dinner attended by 300 people, that he was wrong about a territorial dispute and that she loved him anyway in that order." "What happened?" "He conceded the territory and thanked her, a beat, in that order." I laughed, not the careful, professionally calibrated laugh I had been producing in meetings for 11 years, but the actual thing, the laugh that meant something had genuinely delighted me, and I saw her watch it happen with the particular attention she gave to things she was cataloging and storing. "Saraveth gets her immunity to timing from you too," I said. "She saw something happening and she decided to stop it. That's not just personality, that's judgment." Valeth was quiet for a moment. "She said you looked sad," she said, "when you were walking out." "I was sad." She stopped. The wings shifted. I did not fully consider. That is, I was managing what was visible from my side. I did not allow myself to consider what the situation would produce for you. She looked at me directly. "That was a failure of the care I say I have for you." "You were trying to protect yourself," I said, "and me in your way. You thought removing the situation was cleaner." "It would have been," she said, "for approximately 4 days, and then it would have been." "Terrible for a very long time," I said. "Yes." We sat with that, the quiet shape of what had almost happened, the weight of the 3-week negotiation behind us, the unfamiliar and slightly vertiginous feeling of being on the other side of it. "Thessaly has informed me," Valeth said finally, "that in the context of the human diplomatic community, what we have declared publicly would be described as going public." "That's one way to put it," I said. She also informed me that there is a human cultural convention in which, when a relationship is acknowledged, there is typically an initial period of learning, of navigating the difference between what the relationship was before and what it is now. She looked at me with the directness that was its own kind of declaration. I am uncertain what that looks like for us. I do not have a model for it. I don't either, I said. Not exactly, not for this. Then we will develop one. Is that an order, Your Majesty? I said, and I heard the smile in my own voice before I felt it. The filaments along her wings rippled again. That warm, sustained brightness that I was learning was specific to certain moments. Specific to me and what I did, and that this knowledge was still something I was getting used to. It is a proposal, she said. I am told those are more customarily appropriate. In some contexts, I said, orders are fine too. She looked at me for a long moment, those solar eclipse eyes, the warm walls of the room, the stars moving outside. Noted, she said. Saraveth, for her part, was insufferable about it. Not in a malicious way. In the way of a 10-year-old who had done something she considered very important and was waiting for the appropriate recognition of her contribution. I found her in the ship's garden bay 2 days after the council session concluded, a room full of Saranthari bioluminescent plantwork that made the whole space glow a soft green, which was also, I noted, exactly the color of Saraveth's wing filaments. She was sitting cross-legged on a low bench with a data tablet and a look of concentrated innocence that would have been completely convincing on almost any other child. I wanted to thank you, I said. For what? She said, in a tone of such elaborate casualness that it was clear she had been waiting for this. For saying the things you said, I said. It took courage. And it was the right call. She looked at the tablet. I was merely stating accurate information. Yes, in a moment when stating accurate information was a complicated thing to do. She appeared to consider whether to continue with the performance of nonchalance and decided against it. She looked up. Her enormous eclipse eyes were, in the green light of the garden bay, even more luminous than usual. She was going to let you go, she said, and her voice was very small now, no longer the declaratory seriousness of the office moment, but the voice of a child who had been genuinely frightened. She has done that before, with things she cared about. She decides they are too complicated and she moved her small hands in a gesture that I recognized from Valeth, an almost identical movement that meant dismisses, removes, sets aside. And then later she is sadder, but she has decided it was the correct choice, and she does not say so. You've seen her do that, I said. 3 times, Saraveth said. After my father, after the poet who used to come for the winter summit, after the Korani mediator she almost trusted. She paused. I thought you were going to be the 4th time. I thought she was going to do it again and you were not going to know why and she was going to be quieter. She gets quieter when she loses something she wanted. The luminescent filaments pulsed, slow and unsteady, in a way I was learning to read as distress. I did not want her to be quieter. I sat down on the bench beside her. That was a very brave thing to do, I said, to speak up like that to her. She was not happy with me. No, and you did it anyway. She was quiet for a moment. She came to my room that night, she said. She sat with me for a long time. She said that I was not wrong to say what I said. She said that she was going to try to be less afraid of the things she cares about. A beat. She used the word try. That is unusual for her. She usually says I will or I have decided. It's a hard word, I said, for people who are used to being certain. Saraveth nodded seriously. She also said that you were. She used a word that my translator said means something like anchor, someone who keeps a thing from drifting. She said you had been that for a long time without knowing she thought of you that way. I sat with that for a moment. The garden bay glowed around us, green and warm. She talks to you, I said. She talks to Thessaly, Saraveth said. I listen. She said it without apology, with the complete pragmatism of a child who has found a workable information system. Thessaly knows I listen. I think she talks near me on purpose sometimes, when she thinks my mother needs indirect communication. That's a sophisticated operation, I said. Saraveth shrugged, which was a very human gesture that I suspected she had picked up from watching the diplomatic meetings. Someone has to manage the situation. I looked at this child, this small, green luminescent person with her enormous eyes and her grandmother's complete immunity to timing and her quiet, steady love for her mother that had taken the form of watching carefully and speaking at exactly the right catastrophic moment. Saraveth, I said, I am going to tell you something that I mean very seriously. She looked at me. Whatever happens in the years ahead between your mother and me, and in the negotiations, and in all the very complicated structural arrangements that the Council of Rings is going to spend the next decade reviewing, I am going to be very aware that you were the reason any of it happened, and I am not going to forget that. She considered this with the gravity it deserved. I'm also very observant in general, she said, if that is useful. I suspect, I said, that it will be. She nodded once, with the air of someone who has confirmed an arrangement to their satisfaction, and returned to her data tablet. I signed the new liaison agreement 6 weeks later. The terms were different from the original arrangement. There were oversight protocols, regular council review sessions, a formal declaration of the relationship in the Saranthari public record that had generated, from what Thessaly told me, a response ranging from cautious approval to enthusiastic support, depending on which ring of the homeworld you were asking. Earth's Urcom had been informed through proper channels. My supervisor had looked at the formal declaration, looked at me, and said, I told you that commendation was a love letter, with the satisfaction of someone who has been right for a very long time. The treaty negotiations continued. Valeth sat across the table from the delegations I was coordinating. I sat at a different table, with a different title, not liaison anymore, but something that the translation AIs had rendered as acknowledged partner of the crown, which was both formally accurate and very strange to see on a badge. We were careful. We were transparent. We made every decision about the treaty with both of our professional responsibilities in full view, and the council watched, and the Urcom watched, and we gave them nothing to find. It was harder than it had been when the relationship was unacknowledged. It was also, in the way of things that are harder, considerably better. In the evenings, after the formal sessions ended, I sometimes found my way to Valeth's office or she found her way to mine. The geography shifted, which I had not expected, but which turned out to be a signal of something I was still learning to read in her. When she came to me, she was tired. When she came to me tired, she sat near the window and talked about the session, or sometimes didn't talk about the session, or sometimes didn't talk at all, and the silence was its own kind of information. One evening, about 3 months into the new arrangement, she said, Saraveth has asked whether you will be at the Winter Summit. I'll be at the Winter Summit, I said. She has also asked whether you will attend her presentation at the Young Scholars Forum on Marin Station. It is in the spring. I looked at Valeth. She was looking at the window. Yes, I said, I'll be there. She will want you to notice the section on cross-species diplomatic communication, Valeth said, with careful neutrality. She has been working on it for several months. It wouldn't happen to be about observational methodology in complex interpersonal situations, Valeth said. Yes, largely. She's presenting a paper, I said slowly, about how she watches people. She is presenting a paper, Valeth agreed, about how she watches people. She has titled it The Role of Accurate Information in Preventing Avoidable Outcomes. I was quiet for a moment. She is going to be a handful, I said. She has always been a handful, Valeth said, and something in her voice, something I was still learning to hear in the register beneath the Queen's controlled precision, was entirely, unmistakably warm. She has been a handful since she was 3 years old and informed a Dravathi admiral that his tactical argument was based on a false premise, and she would explain why if he would please sit down. A pause. He sat down. Of course he did, I said. The filaments along Valeth's wings rippled, warm, steady. That particular brightness that I had learned was specific to certain moments. I had been learning its vocabulary. I was still learning. There was more of it to learn than I had originally understood, and I found, with a consistency that would have surprised me 3 years ago, that this was not a problem. It was the opposite of a problem. It was a thing I was going to spend a very long time on, carefully, without hurrying, and it was going to be worth every minute. The winter summit happened, then the spring, then another year. The Council of Rings completed their first formal review and submitted a report that used the words structurally sound and evidence of sustained good faith in close proximity to each other, which Thessaly told me was as close to enthusiastic approval as the Council's formal language was capable of expressing. Saraveth presented her paper. The Young Scholars Forum gave her a commendation. She was 11 by then, and she accepted the commendation with the specific composure of someone who had expected it. Valeth sat in the audience for the presentation, in the seat she had reserved 6 weeks in advance, and she did not look at the paper or the commendation but at her daughter, and the filaments of her wings were lit with that sustained warm brightness the whole time. I sat 2 seats away from her, because we were still careful about the formal optics of public settings, and I watched the same thing she was watching. And at the end of the presentation, when Saraveth looked out at the audience and found us, her enormous eclipse eyes going from her mother to me and back again, she smiled. Not the restrained Saranthari expression, not the controlled social signal. The real thing, wide and bright and entirely without diplomatic calculation. Valeth's wings flared. Just briefly, just enough. I had learned by then what that meant. Later that evening, I wrote in my professional log, the one that went to the Ur-Com and the Council of Rings and the Oversight Protocol, and everyone who needed to be watching, a precise and careful summary of the day's events. In my private journal, which went nowhere, I wrote, "A 10-year-old saved my life about a year ago, not from anything that would have killed me, from the kind of loss that happens slowly and quietly, and that you don't notice until you're on the other side of where you meant to be, looking back at where you were. I think about that sometimes, about what it cost her to say what she said, at 10 years old, in a room with a queen who had 17 layers of warning in her voice, about what it meant that she said it anyway, because she thought the outcome mattered, and she was the only one positioned to change it. I've been a diplomat for a long time. I've been in a lot of rooms where the right thing to say was complicated and the wrong thing to say was easier, and most people chose the easier thing. I've done it myself. Saraveth chose the harder thing, without training, without precedent, out of something that looked a lot like love, the kind that doesn't announce itself and doesn't ask to be acknowledged and just quietly keeps watch and speaks when it matters. I'm going to spend a long time being grateful for that. I'm going to spend a very long time, and it's going to be a good life. And I would not have known it was possible if a child with green-lit wings and her grandmother's immunity to timing hadn't stood up in a queen's private office and told me the truth. And word count, runtime, minutes at 160 WPM.